In this video, we're going to look at two different approaches to how people make choices. So the first approach is called the classical approach. This mostly comes from economists, and economists basically think that people are quite good at making decisions. So we weigh our options, and we choose in ways that are going to allow us to best satisfy our preferences. The second kind of approach is called the behavioral approach, and this mainly comes from psychologists. And they say, no, actually, that's not realistic. We just can't make these kinds of optimal trade offs in the way that economists say. So often, on this view, people make mistakes. They fail to make decisions that maximize their well being. So now let's look at some examples of phenomena that each of these two approaches can explain. Let's suppose you're heading to the supermarket. So the classical view says you're going to have a very neat and orderly trip through the supermarket. You go into the store with a list of items that you need. When you're at the store, you'll buy items that reflect deep preferences, not items that tempt you in the moment. You go by the milk section and you compare all the different brands and all the different sizes, choosing the one that balances your desire for tasty milk against the fact that some of the other brands are more expensive. You head over to the junk food aisle and you think about whether you might want to buy some potato crisps. On the one hand, they taste good now, but on the other hand, they might be bad for you in the long run. You decide against it. Besides, they weren't on your list to begin with. Next, you head over to the soup aisle. There's a new broccoli flavor you haven't tried before. Broccoli. Well, you calculate the probability that might taste good, and you weigh that against the cost you'd have to pay if actually it tastes bad. On balance, you decide against taking this risk, but it was a close call. Next, you head over toward the florist section, and you decide whether you want to buy some flowers for your mother to remind her that you love her. No, you don't. Because you don't particularly care about flowers, and if your mother wants them so much, she can buy them for herself. You keep going in this way until you've bought all the items on your list in a way that successfully balances your tastes against your wallet. As you can see, classical economics thinks of economic decision makers like consumers and managers as being basically rational. So, what do we mean here by rational? Well, we mean that the economic agents are consistent. So they have underlying preferences that are the same across different situations. So when we make a shopping list, that's basically writing down our preferences, which aren't going to change over time. We're consistent. Agents are maximizers, according to classical economics. So they account for every aspect of every option, and they make the best possible choice given the information given. So that's like in the milk example, where you weighed all the different brands and all the different sizes of milk to try to choose the best one. But also, classical economic agents are able to weigh probabilities with mathematical precision, like in the soup example, where you were weighing the different risks of a good versus a bad soup experience against the cost of buying the soup. Agents are patient, so they plan for the future. You can weigh the pleasures of now against the needs of your future self, like in the potato crisp example, where you decided that even though this is something that might taste good now, it maybe isn't going to be good for you in the long run. And in classical economics, agents are selfish. They care about their own preferences, but they don't really think about other people. So in this case, not buying flowers for your mother would be an example of something that's selfish in the economic sense. But of course, in the real world, often our decisions are much messier. So the behavioral approach to choice says that we often make decisions that are not fully rational and fully calculating in the way that classical economics says. So let's suppose again that you went to the supermarket. Maybe you made a list, but you don't necessarily follow what you wrote down. Your preferences are different when you wrote the list versus when you're in the actual store, and you buy a lot of things you hadn't originally planned on purchasing, while deciding that maybe you don't need some of the other ones. Now you go over to the milk section, and you just pick the first one that seems good enough. You're in a hurry after all. You go over by the crisps, and you buy several bags because you're kind of hungry now. The future's for somebody else to worry about. You check out the soups, and you pass on that broccoli soup because you're afraid of being disappointed. You don't think too much about the probabilities that's worth it or not, but you go with your gut. Next, you go over by the flowers, and you think your mother might really enjoy some roses. She spent years raising you, so why not give something nice? You finish up your shopping trip, Not making totally crazy decisions, but also not thinking too hard about any one choice. So, as you can see, these kinds of decisions seem to differ markedly from those described by classical economics. Instead, these seem to be better described by a newer approach called behavioral economics, which says that people aren't totally rational. They don't make perfect decisions. Instead, they are boundedly rational. People try their best, but they're limited, and they do the best they can within those limits. And there's several important limits to think about here. People aren't totally consistent, and their behavior can vary from one situation to another. They don't necessarily have a stable set of preferences like those that would be reflected on a shopping list, but instead they can vary. People don't look at every single aspect of every option or weigh probabilities carefully. Instead, they satisfice, meaning that they choose options that are good enough but not necessarily optimal. So in the milk case, you chose the first kind of milk that seemed good enough. You made your decision about the soup based on your gut. So those are examples of satisficing. So in behavioral economics, people are often impatient. We don't think about the future very much, and we pay too much attention to our needs and desires in the present moment, like when we bought those crisps. And finally, in behavioral economics, people are allowed to care about each other. They're at least somewhat altruistic, like when you bought those roses for your mother. So in the end, which of these models is right? Well, neither. Neither has a monopoly on the truth here. The classical approaches do a good job of explaining rational, goal-directed behaviors. So humans do make reasonably good decisions much of the time. If we didn't, our ancestors wouldn't have survived. But at the same time, we're limited, and we can't make perfect decisions the way that economists like to assume that we can. So we also have to understand the situations where people diverge from classical, rational approaches. If you want to understand how real people make decisions, you have to understand both kinds of approaches and think about which one makes the most sense for any particular situation.